All right, welcome everybody. This is the fourth episode of the Fantasy Book Critics Authors and Their Favorite Books video interview series. Joining me today is one of my special authors, Rachel Aaron. She is kindly agreed to be on this interview today and will be revealing which book she has selected. But before that, I would love for her to introduce herself. So Rachel, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. Hello, I am Rachel Aaron. I also write as Rachel Bach. I am the author of the Legend of Eli Mompress series, the Heartstrikers Dragon series, which starts with Night Dragons Finish Last. I wrote a book about MMO gaming with my husband called Forever Fantasy Online. I have written another series in the DFZ called Minimum Wage Magic. I wrote the YA novel for Attack on Titan called Garrison Girl. I'm all over the place. I write a lot of stuff, and I'm here today to talk about my favorite book, or my favorite book of the current moment, because it changes.
Well, thank you. And I can only say that having read all of them, that they are as diverse in their genre and writing content, but especially you, with regards to the excellent characters, the funny moments, and of course, this massive plot, which you never know in the first book, but then you eventually find out and you're amazed. Well, at least for me, that is. All right,
I love complicated things.
Well, which is the book you would like us, which is currently holding your interest at the moment and which you'd like to talk about today, Rachel?
I would like to talk about Clockwork Boys by T. Kingfisher, who is also known as Ursula Vernon. And if any of you have children, you'll probably know her better by her Danny Dragon Breath books, which is this is my son's book that I just picked up, and they are hilarious. All of her stuff is just the wittiest thing. And when Mihir reached out to me and asked me about this, I had a whole bunch of books in mind. But I realized all the books I was suggesting were all published like 20 years ago. And I really wanted to do something that was modern, because I hate it when you go to our Reddit fantasy and they're like, what book should I read? And it's like the same 15 books over and over again. And I didn't want to be that person, because I am an author writing currently. And if you go to a lot of book suggestions lists, you wouldn't think anyone was writing books anymore, because they're all like 20 years old. So I really wanted to pick a more modern book. So this was a book I read recently, as it was the last couple of years, that I just really enjoyed and felt needed to be talked about, because it is phenomenal. And I believe it was kind of her first adult book, because she started as a kid's book writer. Yep. And it is very adult. It's definitely not for the younger audiences, but it is a beautiful hot mess of a novel. So can't wait to talk about it. It is a mess. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for selecting this one. And you're right. Reddit, our fantasy aside, they always keep on coming with the same suggestions. And oh dear gods, the Malazan fanboys. Oh. I say this with all respect to Steve Erickson and INC Asimont. What they have written, it's not for me. I know there are plenty of fans, even within Fantasy Critic, our founder loves those books, but it's not for me. But I cannot just, it's fun now to even predict, oh, look, the second comment will be Malazan. It is Malazan. And then I literally remember once somebody was recommending something, asking for a recommendation about not a medieval fantasy, but more like an urban fantasy. And the third comment was Malazan. And I was like, oh dear God, what is this with these people?
Anything you want.
Yes.
If the only thing you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. Every problem can be solved with Malazan. Yeah, I'm the same way, because I'm always looking for new books, and I look at your blog, I look at a whole bunch of stuff, because I tend to read, it's funny, I tend to read a lot, stuff that's very different than I write. As a reader, I tend toward things that are much more lyrical, much more poetic. I recently really loved Naomi Novik's Uprooted, which was a beautiful book, painful book. I described to my husband, I was like, reading this is like falling down the world's most beautiful set of stairs. It is so beautiful, and it hurts so much, and you can't stop. It's awful, and I love it. But that's not what I write. I write fun, action, adventure, characters, giant drama, but I read these hot messes. And but that's important, though, because if I read books that are very much like what I write, I find myself editing internally. So I tend to like to read books that are nothing like me, so I can actually let go and enjoy reading.
that fact that you mentioned, that that writers often tend to edit their own, when they're reading new books, it's hard for them to shut out their editor brain. That is something which has been noted by a couple of other authors of mine, and it is a harder thing to do, and especially when you want to just switch off and enjoy the book. I completely get you on that. Yeah, and you're absolutely right about this book being recent. It was published in 2017. It is the first part of a duology by T. Kingfisher, which is the adult pseudonym of Ursula Vernon. And you mentioned it was a hot mess. We will get to that. But what I want to know specifically is what about this book made it such an interesting read for you? What drove you to it? How did you discover it? Was it random, happenstance?
Oh, this was an Amazon recommendation. I am the queen of download a sample chapter. My Kindle is 90% sample chapters, because I never buy a book until I get to the end of the sample, because I am very, very, very picky. And this, well, it's one, because I try to give everything a chance, but I'm also not afraid to put stuff down, which is, as a writer, why I put the most time into the first 200 words. But Amazon recommended it. I was kind of vaguely feeling in the mood. I actually thought it was a Western at first. Just because it has kind of a clockwork Western type of look to the cover, as judging a book by its cover, as I'm guilty of. And I started reading it, and just right off the bat, Slate, who's the main character, she is hilarious. And the language of the book, just the way Ursula Vernon, T. Kingfisher, the way the author writes was just so interesting and beautiful and smart and entertaining. I'm like, well, I'm going to read this just to hear her talk. I can just sit and listen to this lady talk. I don't really care where the plot's going. And then I got really into it, and I really enjoyed the characters. I thought it was super unique. And this is revealed in the first chapter. It's not a spoiler, but one of the characters, Caliban, is a paladin who was in trouble because a demon he was trying to defeat got into his head and died. So he's walking around with this demon corpse in his mind, and it's driving him mad. And I'm like, that is 10 kinds of the coolest thing. And I was just so there for it. And, I'll be the first to say the plot was really weird. The structure was very odd. I would not have structured the book that way, but I'm not here for what I would have done. I'm here as a reader to be entertained. And this is a problem of kind of being in your own pool as an author, is that you're like, I wouldn't have done it that way. And when that doesn't matter, the book is published. That thought has no place. But you can't turn it off. But because it was so different, I was still able to enjoy it, even though I wouldn't have done the plot. And she actually reminds me a lot of China Miéville. Well, in the way she structures things, because Miéville will also have a whole bunch of stuff that will be super cool, but seem very random. Why are we here? This is really neat, but why? And then there'll be some point when it'll all go shoop, and everything will come together. And I'm not a fan of that way. I like to see stuff building. And if you read my novels, you'll know that's how I plot. But it does work. It is a totally legitimate way to structure a book. Just know that going in, if that's not your cup of tea. But the characters are hilarious and genuinely pitiable. They are in a very bad situation, and I feel very sorry for all of them, but they're very funny. They make very bad decisions for understandable reasons. You see how they got there, and even they know it's a bad decision, but you kind of have to roll with it. And I found them to be very human and relatable. And also, it's a very adult book, not just in that there's a lot of killing and a lot of sex, but these are old characters with a lot of baggage and a lot of problems and a lot of damage. And it's very interesting kind of watching them hobble through this plot on the emotional crutches they've all got going. And it creates this very different reading experience, especially in fantasy, which tends to have a lot of younger characters. You tend to have a lot of people in their 20s, and I'm guilty of this. I write people in their 20s all the time, but watching these 30 and 40-year-olds with complex pasts and ex-lovers just trying desperately to save the world I felt very fun, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the first book a lot more than the second, though. Once she actually had to kind of cash all the checks she'd written. I don't really think she pulled it off as well as she could have, but it was still fun. I mean, I would still recommend it wholeheartedly.
Yeah,
So.
no, I get you on that, guys. And I was chuckling all along because when you mentioned the older characters, I remember there was a passage in the books where Slate and I believe Brenner, the thief, they had to go on, and they're not going on a horse ride. They're going somewhere because they're on a mission. And literally they're complaining that their thighs and their feet, they cannot feel their feet after horse riding for like a long time. And there's a passage, which if I can find, I'll read it out because it's hilarious. There's a lot of humor in this book and a lot of, like you mentioned, it's dark, but it's humor-laced enough that it's not grimdark. And that's a good thing for this regard.
It's this very kind of, you have to laugh or you'll cry kind of book. And I found that super refreshing. Because generally speaking, these kind of serious dark fantasies, they're either young people desperately and sincerely trying to save the world, or they're old, bad, terrible people watching it burn. And I'm not really a fan of either extreme, but this was kind of in the middle because there's still genuinely, there's a core of good in each of these people. And that made it great. They were very easy to root for, even though they're all kind of terrible and I would not invite any of them to my house. Well,
one of them would not come to your house because you're purely a female, the monk, and we'll get to that as well.
That's another thing. And it's kind of like, it was all fun though. I really did enjoy it. It was a hoot to read.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Now, you kind of partially answered this question of mine that, so technically you kind of highlighted that, the author Ursula Vernon has written, younger, children, books for younger, adults or not adults, adolescents and children. But when you chose this book, did you happen to know it was Ursula Vernon, or did you read it and then got amazed by it?
No, and I'm about to tell you the story of the greatest missed opportunity. So I used to live in Athens, Georgia, which is not a very big town. I now live in Colorado, which is way more fun place to live. Weather is much better. But I grew up in Georgia and I lived in Athens for like 20 years. And my son's school, which is right down the road, it was not a big school, was having Ursula Vernon was showing up at their school. And I had no clue who she was. And they had said, do you want to come? There's not going to be many people. And I'm like, nah, I'm busy. Because I was writing, I was busy. And they're like, it's another author, you might know her. And I'm like, she's a traditionally published kids author. We don't overlap at all. And I've got all this stuff to do. I was just too busy. And literally the next day, I started reading Clockwork Boys and fell in love. And then I'm like, who is this woman? And it was Ursula Vernon. And she had literally left a week ago. And I was like, no. I would have been the worst fan. That's the other thing. I am the worst fan. I am like the creepy fan. One time I was at Romantic Times. I was at the RT convention back before they got canceled. I got invited to go speak on a panel. And by Alona Andrews, humble brag. Anyway, I got invited to go speak on the panel. I'm not a romance author. I really kind of didn't belong, but I was so excited because it was such a fun crowd of ladies. And I got put on a panel with like Alona Andrews and Cresley Cole and all these authors I really like. And I'm just sitting at the end like, and they're all like being professionals. And I'm just like, it was, and then I approached Cresley Cole afterwards and I was like, can I take you out to dinner? Can I buy you a drink? And she's like, no, I have to go. Like I bet I seriously creeped her out. And I'm always kind of like a little embarrassed, but proud of myself for going for it. But you just authors, we're just people. We're not like celebrities. We fangirl and stuff too. So I was very excited about it. But anyway, I would have fangirled all over her. So probably for the better that we never met.
I don't know about that, but all authors are celebrities for the readers. Let me just tell you that. Like I fanboy so badly. I've only been once. I know the convention you're talking about. I was following Ilona Andrews in their blogs. That's why I knew about it. And I went to Atlanta for the Dragon Con convention, and I fanboyed so hard on so many authors. I think I had to take a break for like 3 years now. I haven't gone. I'm like, hopefully, maybe this might be the year. So I completely agree with you on that. All right. Now I want to talk to you about the characters, and because you also mentioned the characters, like how older, but damaged they are, but they also have a core of goodness to them. Even Caliban the Paladin, with the demon corpse in its head, the slate for her, she's kind of like the main protagonist from whom literally we start out with in the first chapter. So for you, if you had to pick one thing about this book, which was of course there's many things and I would love to hear all this, but if you had to choose just one thing, what would you say is the best part of this book?
I would say how enjoyable just how it is a fun experience to read. Some books you read for the plot to know what's going to happen. Some books you read because you really enjoy the world. I enjoyed this book just for the people. It was just as I said, the moment I started reading, I'm like, I can just hang out in this world. I can hang out in the feeling of reading this forever. And I'm rereading Harry Potter right now because I'm trying to get my son to read it. And one of the things I'd forgotten, because it's been, decades since I've read Harry Potter, one of the things that I had forgotten is how fun it is to just be in the wizarding world. And this is that same kind of thing, but like the R-rated version. The world is a gross and awful place, so I wouldn't ever want to live there, but it is the way she writes about it, you just want to know everything and hang out with these people and watch them deal. I would watch Slade just be a thief. I would just watch her be a thief for 20 books. Because I find it so cool and fun, and the way she describes it just makes everything sound so interesting. So that's really what it is. It's for me, it's what I call a feel book, where I just like the feel of it, which is how I can ignore a lot of the plot weirdness I talked about earlier, because that's not really what the book's about. It's about being in this world with these people.
I do, since you have mentioned this, the plot weirdness, I do want to talk about that. You also mentioned it's kind of like a hot mess of a book, but it works. And now you have specifically kind of drawn upon the fact that the plot is a little bit wonky. Now those are my words, not yours. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that? Why, and this is from your perspective, because you're also a celebrated author. You do know how this works. I, as a reader, might not know. Maybe there are hundreds of readers like that, who sometimes pick up on things, sometimes they don't. But from your perspective, what was so wonky, again, my words, not yours, about this plot?
There were what I would call caveats. There were side quests that seem very random when you're reading, because we're on a quest to go find the titular Clockwork Boys, who, by the way, don't even enter the book until the very end. If you're here for clockwork giant monsters, well, sit down for a bit. It's going to be a while. But there are all these that they go and they visit this other group of mages, and they go over here and they get waylaid. It's kind of that classic fantasy journey book, because they're on this big trip. And so they go a lot of different places. And most of the book is about all the different places they go, which when you're okay, well, where is this going? It feels very random from the information that is presented. And for example, as an author, one of the things I think about a lot is to always make sure readers understand why things are important. And you don't have to sit there and go, this is important. You don't have to do that. You just have to give them context for what we're doing here and why. And that she did not really, I felt, do that. But it still made sense, because it was just a place they were going on their journey. I don't, if I drive to California, I'm going to pass through Las Vegas. If Las Vegas may not, it's going to be fun. We're going to have a good time. But that doesn't, it's why? It's fun. But that's kind of what it felt like you were on this travel log. But then, of course, it all comes back, and all these things they did there come back in the grand finale. So it all does come back together in the end. But I would have put in a lot more foreshadowing, so that when we were actually in that part of the book, we would understand. Because there were parts of the book where, even though I really liked it, I was kind of if I'd been less enamored with all the good parts of the book, I probably might have put it down, because the tension kind of bottomed. And Ursula, if you're watching this, no disrespect, I really like the book, but that was my professional opinion. And I'm much more sensitive about this than other people, because I do this every day, 8 hours a day. But that was where I thought things were kind of, and again, stylistic choice. Perdido Street Station, which is one of my favorite books. For a lot of the same reasons, awesome characters, insanely weird world, super cool language. But that had the same thing where I was like, why are we even here? What are we doing in this scene? Who are all these new people? You know, that kind of thing. And if you've read dark fantasy, actually, especially dark fantasy is pretty, or any of the new weird books, they do this a lot, where they'll go off on some weird tangent. And you just got to kind of hold the faith that it's going to all come back around, or just forget the plot and just enjoy the ride.
No, that's true, because this was going to be one of my questions later on. We'll talk more about this. The titular Clockwork Boys, they're this massive horrific thing that, you know, which is why they're making this whole trip to the Anuket city to kind of figure out how are they made and what are they actually after, which are like, and I believe they kind of describe like these 10-foot tall, really horrific things. They kill everything. They're basically indestructible. But you don't see them. You don't their presence is felt throughout the story. And of course, like the side quests that they take, like, you know, and which is the funny part is that they're under kind of like not exactly like a time clock, but they're under a curse, all 4 of them. Like they can't just run away. And that's a little bit of, I mean, you can absolutely, there's no spoiler warning, but this is, of course, if you're discussing the book, there's going to be spoilers about it. There's that aspect as well. So yeah, I mean, I love the side quest part, but yeah, it felt a little bit too much of the side quest at times when I was reading it. And I was like, and to be honest with you, I picked up this book because you had recommended it, because I remembered following you in Goodreads, and you're like, this is really a fantastic book. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna buy it. I read it. I was like, it is funny. It has a lot of things going for it, but then some of the things, because like till the end, and it has kind of like not a cliffhanger, but it literally just comes to an end.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's honestly, and this is a giant generalization, but I kind of hate duologies because they always feel like it's one book that got cut in half. And I always feel that way whenever I read one, or read 2, I should say. So but again, you're absolutely right. And I think that is absolutely I would not have done that with the tension. I felt the tension management of the book could have been a lot better. But again, you gotta kind of take it as a whole, and I tend to take it as my feelings on it. So if you're someone who wants a nice, tight, neat little plot, this is not the book for you. But when I do my own plots, I actually get accused of chessboarding, where I set everything up and then I go. This is not that kind of book. So, and but that doesn't mean it's not good. It doesn't have really good qualities, but you're absolutely right. There are parts where I was like, what is even happening? But ultimately, the emotions the book made me feel, because I felt so legitimately connected to all these characters and that's why I kept going, even though things were kind of dragging. I felt so legitimately connected. I felt for Brennan. I felt for him. He was an ass, but I loved him. And I might have a thing for roguish characters. I just loved him, and I felt he was so funny, and I legitimately felt bad about his situation, and I really wanted him to win. And I come to books a lot for how they make me feel. And so, because it's such an emotional art form, writing is. And so that was where I felt it really shone as a work. And this is so funny because I'm like, this is a book I really recommend. Here's everything wrong with it. But it's important to kind of recognize the flaws, because nothing made by humans is ever perfect. And I'm sure we could go along for a long way with the flaws in my books, but it's the package. It's never, because you're never reading a part of a book separately. It's the total, it's all the ingredients that make the stew, you know?
Yeah. No, it does work. And also, since, you know, both of us are like, you know, we really enjoyed this book. Also, as an aside, Goodreads has close to 7,000 ratings for this book, and it's sitting at 4.2. That's pretty amazing. Like, you know, it has its fans. It has, in spite of all of its, you know, things that perhaps didn't work, it is still selling really well. And of course, it is a big deal. I do want to ask you now, since you also mentioned this a little bit earlier, you have read the sequel, The Wonder Engine. What were your thoughts about it, and why did you like it as much? Not like it as much?
I didn't like it as much. Honestly, weirdly, because it had more plot. Because it had to wrap up the whole story, because it's the second in a duology. And I actually felt this book should have been a trilogy with more spent on the actual big conflict that we all are here for. Like the reason we're all doing this, it was much more focused on Caliban and the demon and his interest than the Clockwork Boys, which again, why we're here, name of the series, and or name of the first book. But it was full of cool ideas. It was still as cool. It was still the same people, but I don't think it was as well done as the first one. And it makes me a little upset, because having read her Dragon Breath books, her Dany Dragon Breath books with my son, I know she can plot. I know she can write a very tight, very neat little plot. And she just and you know, I'm not going to criticize how she did it, but I wanted a lot more than I got. So I would not rate the Wonder Engine as highly. I still read it and enjoyed it, and I liked having an ending. And the ending was fine. Like, I don't really have any, I felt satisfied, but I just felt it could have been so much more. I felt we could have gone so much higher with this. So that is my one big complaint, but I still stand by my recommendation of the first one. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, that's perfectly fair. And every person's different. People like, you know, some people like the first book, some people like the endings. Like you mentioned, this is a duology. So you're either in one camp or the other. There's no middle ground, literally to speak.
Yeah, there's no middle. You can't have, it's one or the other. And all I can really say is give it a try, because again, it is a very unique book, which in a world of knockoffs, that is something that is not to be discredited. I would rather take a really unique hot mess I've never read than a perfect book I've read 1,000 times. You know, I would much, and maybe that's just me. Like, I've read so much now that I am overvaluing novelty.
Mm-hmm.
But I really love finding something I've never seen before, because I see the same idea so many times. And I'm also like, I'm a big anime and manga fan. And that is the worst. They are the worst for rehashing ideas. They'll make an entire like industry out of like one idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I really love getting something new.
No, and that is a very valid point. Like, you know, and I can tell you this as a reader as well, because readers are always looking for the next new thing. That's why, you know, like in the early 2000s, you had the whole urban fantasy craze.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the kind of like the middle, the 2010s, you had like the grimdark phase where people were just jumping onto grimdark. Nowadays, and I think you kind of also, you know, you were in the starting of it, the lit RPG phase. Like nowadays, there's like a whole bunch of lit RPG books and progression fantasies, but of course, they all seemingly look like clones of each other. So of course, you want to find the unique one, the one with, okay, even if it is done the same route, what's the new spin on it? That's the thing.
Exactly. And actually, ironically, so we wrote Forever Fantasy Online as honestly a pure vanity project, because we still play World of Warcraft. We played World of Warcraft starting in 2004. We loved World of Warcraft. We were raiders. My husband and I, we did all that stuff. And so I'd wanted to write a Warcraft book for so long, but of course you can't get an IP for that. And also, I mean, that world is such a mess. At this point, who knows how it's still going. Money is how it's still going. But this lit RPG lit my brain on fire, because I was like, I could finally write a book about Warcraft and about what makes Warcraft good and what makes MMOs good. And so that's really what it's about, but it's not actually really a lit RPG as the genre has kind of come to be. It's not a progression fantasy. It's not a power fantasy, really. It's a story about a raiding guild that gets sucked into a game, and all of these normal people suddenly have to become heroes. Whether or what, they have to stop pretending and actually do it. And I loved it because, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, Roxy might kind of be me. And even though it's probably my least popular book, honestly, because a lot of my readers are like, lit RPG. And a lot of lit RPG readers are like, that's not lit RPG. So I'm neither fish nor fowl, but I love it. It's one of my favorite things I ever worked on. And, you know, you got to go with your heart in this business. You really do.
It is different, and I love it too. Like Roxy, in the first book, she was a little bit of, no, I wouldn't say she was a difficult character. She was a lot, because she was also, her character, again, a little bit of spoilers, she's literally being forced to take a whole group and make them survive through insanely dangerous territory while they're all thinking that this can still be a game. And their literal lives are at stake. And I forget her brother's name, but her brother characters,
James.
the what? Sorry,
James.
James. Yes,
James.
thank you. Bad with names. He was doing so much interesting stuff. So I love the series because again, the plotting, the end, how it all comes through. I loved it. I can also see why.
People criticize the first FFO book for Roxy being very unlikable, and in hindsight, they're not wrong. And I wouldn't have, like, I knew what I wanted, and I don't think I actually got there. I was walking kind of a fine line. And again, this is where writing to your heart kind of bites you in the butt sometimes, because you're in love with it. And sometimes you can't really be as distant as you need to be. But I'm not ashamed of the book. I'm really proud of what we did. If I could go back and fix it, I would fix that, but I'm not going to, because there's no point in going back and editing books that are already published. But again, this is what I mean about, like, no book is perfect. And you got to just, that's why it's so important to just read stuff, just give things a chance. Because even, like, sometimes reviews can be terrible. And I'll still, if I think the book is cool, I'll still give it a good chance. Because sometimes what they're complaining about might be true, and I don't care. That has happened to me, so.
Fair enough. And of course, as an author, you get to make the choice. And the one good thing about Roxy is that you get to see why she's like that. The second book makes it perfectly clear. The third book is incredible. Like, the way you ended things, I loved it. Like, I loved James, but I also loved Roxy by the end. So it
was our trip to Ice Crown Citadel. I had a great time. So
it was fun. It was a whole bunch of it. All right, getting back to Clockwork Boys, because we're here to talk about that. Let's talk about this fact that, these Clockwork Boys, that they're these automatons, or it's kind of not really described what they are. One thing which I was getting from the book is, like, there's these touches of horror to it. Like, whenever there's the Clockwork Boys are mentioned, or you get to see the aftermath of when they've been through some area, that part of the book is, you can literally divorce it from the rest of the book, because that is truly horror. Like, I wouldn't even call it dark fantasy. I would say that is like horror tinged in those regards. Would you say that was the case for you?
I'd say you're 100% correct. And I'm actually a pretty big fan of horror. But I'm not a big fan of contemporary. So I really love it when horror shows up in other places, because I love the tension elements it brings. And I actually have worked some horror into my newest stuff just because I like it. I like the feeling of it. And I totally agree. She just went straight horror in some of that stuff. But it was, again, very refreshing, because it wasn't, the thing about the Clockwork Boys in this particular book that I really liked is you weren't actually sure the hero was going to win. Like, a lot of times in fantasy, you know the good guys are going to win, and it's the how that you're reading for. But in Clockwork Boys, there were long portions of that book where I was like, wait a minute, is this a tragedy? Are we going to lose? Is the Dark Lord going to win? I legitimately didn't know. And that tension was so cool. Again, haven't felt that in a fantasy in a very long time. Actually, the one fantasy tragedy that I've ever read is Jacqueline Carey's Baneraker.
Ooh, yeah.
Which is one of my all-time favorite books. And it's the Lord of the Rings told from the perspective of the bad guys.
Yep.
And from page 1, it's going to be a tragedy, but you're reading, maybe they'll pull it off. And you're like rooting for the bad. It's so brilliant. It's such a brilliant book. And it's got some of the best lines I've ever read. Loved it, really did.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk a little bit more of this because you opened this fascinating aspect of horror in fantasy. I don't find it, but I love it. Coming to Baneraker, yes, you're absolutely right. It is told from like this general who's fighting a war and who's helping his lord with, but it's literally from like Sauron's viewpoint, to pull off your Lord of the Rings analogy. And it's 2 books. Oh, again, a duology, if I'm not wrong.
Split down the middle. I actually read it as the omnibus, so I didn't even notice 2 books because it was just published as one.
Yep.
I have a big hardcover that I bought used, and it was great. And I
Same for me.
money. It was amazing.
It is like because the only reason I found it was a duology, because when I was looking it up, like I bought the hardcover as well. Cover not so much great, but then I found out there's like 2 paperback editions. And I was like, oh, so this is a duology of it. And yeah, it is perhaps again not, it didn't sell as well as her other books are, with the Cushiel universe and everything. But you were saying something.
Oh no, I was saying I think it didn't sell as well, again, because you're right, the cover was terrible. And I think it's Tor, which is weird because their covers are normally really good. But it was it made it look like this kind of Celtic fantasy romantic story, which it is not.
No.
I can totally see why it didn't sell as well as some of her other stuff, because that was a very much in the realm of like Mists of Avalon kind of feminist fantasy, very sexy, very modern actually. Crucial's Dart, which I read most of the series. I kind of petered off toward the end because things started getting weird. But the first book is amazing, and it's this wonderful dark fantasy world, a lot going on, and then you get to Baneraker, which is an utterly different animal. It is 100% an epic fantasy. It is Lord of the Rings. It is slow. It is an ensemble cast. So you got tons of different viewpoints, but it was beautiful, and you could really tell that she wrote this book because she loved it, not because it was going to sell. And you can feel that, like that passion she had for it in all of it. And it has some of the best lines, like, you know, the general is talking to the Dark Lord, and they make this really bad decision, and they both know it's a bad idea, but they kind of have to do it. And it says, you know, and the weight of all the blood yet unspilled lay between them. And I'm just like,
wow.
You know? Also, like, death is a coin to be spent wisely. I use that line like on a daily basis in my household. You know, if you're going to do that, death is a coin to be spent wisely. And I mean, that's how good it is.
That is a cool line.
We're here to talk about Clockwork Boys, and I'm just like talking about every other book, but
no,
they're all connected.
I do want to talk about this because, you know, horror and fantasy is not really explored. Like, there's very few examples of horror and fantasy. The only other thing I can think of is there was this book released in like late 2010s, and I'm going to kill myself because I do not remember that. I remember like what's it, and the cool part of the book is that the author, we interviewed her later, a while later, and she basically had inserted prions into her fantasy world. But of course, she didn't really label them, and she basically was describing how prions called genetic mutation, and that's how the horror was being encapsulated. I wish more authors were doing this, or I wish publishers were kind of pushing like the horror edge of fantasy, because dark fantasy is good, grimdark fantasy is good, but again, there's repetition in that. But horror is so unique. I wish, like you, again, contemporary horror is okay.
True horror is, and like a good ghost story in a fantasy, or because ghosts in fantasy kind of lose a lot of their fear, because a lot of times you can just kill a ghost in fantasy. And I think one of the reasons that horror tends to be contemporary is because it works better when it's closer to you, and contemporary is like right in your face in your world, and no one has magical powers. But that doesn't mean it can't work in other things, especially in and this is not to be confused with just gore, because there's a lot of dark fantasy where they're just like, behead 30 people. But that's not really horror. That doesn't scare you, especially like the psychological horror. Which can make things feel so intimate and claustrophobic, which is very unique in fantasy, which tends to be very wide angle lens, if you get what I mean. Like, it tends to be very big. And so I just love seeing people. I love the mixing of genres, as evidenced by everything I've ever written. My very first editor, Davey Ply at Orbit, was like, we have a problem. You write books I can't shelve. What am I supposed to say to the bookstore? Where do they put it? And I'm like, you know, and she still yells at me about this. Whenever I occasionally talk, she is amazing, by the way. She is now working at Tor, and she is I was just going to mention that for the people who do not know, Devi Pillai was first a senior editor at Orbit Books. I think in late 2016, 2017 is when she made the move to Tor. She's now like the head person, or like just the second in command of the Tor books. And also she's making her presence felt because she, finally got James Rollins, the ultra successful New York Times bestselling author, to return to fantasy after 15 years. He released his new fantasy book earlier this year in 2021. She is very persuasive.
Yeah. And she also got Brian McClellan, I'm mispronouncing his last name, to switch from Orbit Books after a successful, I think, 6, 7, 8 books, to switch to Tor as well. So Tor is doing some pretty interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, she is doing amazing things at Tor. She is incredible. Tor did such a good job to hire her. She found me. She's the editor who found me and published lot of my books. And when I went to self-publishing, she was like personally insulted. I didn't send her Heart Strikers. She's still mad at me about that, but she is just the loveliest, smartest person I've ever met in my life. And she is one of the reasons that I am the author I am, because that's another thing that I kind of had that a lot of self-published authors don't, is I started in traditional publishing and I was I had a lot to learn, as I think all authors do. Like the author who starts out like at a professional level is very rare. We all grow. Because I got my agent, I was published, I had to go through my Lindsay Rebar, Stanford Rimberger, she edited me. She was my agent's assistant, and she was like, we got to fix this book for the Spirit Thief. And because of the things she told me, I am such a better writer. Same with Davey. Davey wrote me an 11-page editorial letter for the second Paradox novel. And I don't think I have ever felt more despair than looking at that letter, because she like mailed it. It was long. I know she emailed it to me, but we printed it and it was long. But because of all that feedback, and also because this was not an editor I had hired, because I wasn't self-publishing, this was an editor who was paying me. And I had to fix it or bye-bye contract. You know, you grow fast. And if I'd started writing now, I don't think that I would have gotten to where I am in the same amount of time without all that help that I had, without all that lifting up. And when I talk to people now about self-publishing, they're like, oh, obviously you run self-publishing. I'm like, well, no, there's a lot of different, money, you can't beat it. And now at this stage in my life, house, gotta pay, gotta live.
Yep.
Things are expensive. Self-publishing is the way I can support myself and my family by writing. But if you're looking for other things, if you want to be famous, if you want a movie deal, if you want to have someone really work on writing with you, then New York is amazing. Like people poo-poo it all the time, but they are really, really good at what they do. And the people who work in New York publishing are phenomenal. These are people who care enormously about books and are really good at their jobs.
That they are. And that's why Devi Pillai is the president and publisher of Tor Macmillan. I just looked it up. She was the second in command, but now she's like the top person. Also fun fact.
I can say I knew her when.
Yeah. She also shares the same name as your character from the Paradox trilogy, Devi.
Yeah, which is so funny because I named my character that before I met Davey. And I said it to her, and I was like, I didn't name this lady after you. She's kind of like, well, you should have. And I was just like,
Devi Pillai. Also, the word Devi in the Indian languages, it means goddess. From the way you're describing her, I can see that. Why she
calls herself the Anna Wintour of SFF, and that is.
I can see that. Yeah,
she's a force of nature.
She's a force of nature. Well, a good force, definitely a good force. Oh, and that book which I was talking about, I remember the previous book to it. This book is called Heaven's Needle by Leanne Merciel. It's that one which has got the horror tinge to it. Her debut book was River Kings Road, which was more of like a fun, no, not fun. It was kind of like semi-dark, semi-epic fantasy about a mercenary kind of helping out a woman who's being chased, and a royal prince, a royal baby who's being chased by other bad people. But the key part of that book, never mind. That's a book for a different story. I'm a fan. I'll talk to you later about that.
We can clearly talk about books forever. And
I know.
That's what's so fun. That's what's so fun about being in this world, is that there's always different books to read. There's always more. People talk to me, you're writing books quickly. Supposedly, like my publishing schedule does not match my writing schedule, because I keep trunking books that don't meet my standards. Actually, we were talking about this before we started recording, but I trunk a lot of books because I'm like, if I'm not 100% proud of it, I don't publish it. And because of that, I throw away a lot of work. Not throw away, I put aside a lot of work. Because it had a great premise, but I couldn't make it work. And I'm not going to put out something I'm not proud of. But one of the things I get asked is like, oh, are you worried that like you'll be writing books too fast for people to read? And I'm like, people take a book that took me 6 months to write and they will read it in 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never gonna run out. I'm never gonna outpace these people.
Guilty as charged. Whenever your book lands, if you give me the ARC, I literally will spend the night. Like if I can, once my children are, because nowadays with the job and the children, it becomes a little bit tricky, but I'm reading on my phone until then. And then literally once they're asleep and I'm off to bed, I'm reading it through. So yeah, I'm not sorry technically, because I love to read your books and they're like addictive, very addictive. And I can't reveal something, but I will talk about it at the end. All right, getting back to Clockwork Books, because we are getting started.
Getting back on topic. I promised I wouldn't ramble. Studies showed this was a lie.
No, this is great. What I do want to talk to you about was like, how much you enjoyed the banter between the characters, between Slate and Brenner, Slate and Calvin, and probably most everyone's favorite character, Learned Edmund, the monk who will not talk to females, but is a brilliant monk, but is, of course, his entire sect is scared of the female form. What I wanted to ask you was how much you enjoyed that.
I loved it. Well, all the chemistry was so good. Like the book was at its absolute best when they were just talking to each other, which was fun because it's a journey story. So a lot of the time is spent just with them going places and talking. It's almost kind of a road trip novel, and with horrible attacks and fighting. And but yeah, Learned Edmund was he was so annoying, but in such an interesting way, because he's clearly a good person and a smart person, but he's come from this background that's insufferable. And then Slade, being who she is, can't like resist wheedling him. And it's just so funny, but also kind of so wrong. And I loved it. It was all really funny. And I have this kind of like internal theory that basically you have characters who are knights and characters who are rogues, and you get your best chemistry when you put these two together. It's like the comedian and the straight man, right? And you need the straight man to make the comedian funny. Same thing with like Learned Edmund and Slade are both interesting characters, but when you put them together, that is where the magic happens. And that is absolutely where this book was at its best, was watching all of these characters bouncing off each other, and you know where they come from. You've seen their backgrounds, and they're all acting completely in character and just hitting each other constantly, not physically, but just bouncing off each other, like disagreeing and trying to still work together toward this much bigger, very important job they're on. But it's kind of this weird, it's almost an office drama in a way, because they're all on the same task, but that's making too light of it. But it has that kind of appeal. And again, I could listen to them talk forever. I could listen to them argue about things that don't even matter, and I would just love it. I would just sit there and it'd be fun.
No, it is. And it's like, I was just like this banter which you're talking about. And I have an example, because this was the thing which I remembered, like it was so funny and coarse. The humor is a little bit coarse at times, but it was funny. And I just want to read that out if that's okay with you.
Oh, go for it.
They ascended the stairs like a pair of mountaineers tackling a cliff face. My legs will never close again, she muttered. That would be music to my ears if I wasn't dying, said Brenner, a step below her. Do you think we'll make it to Anuket City? I don't think I'll make it to my room. Eventually, of course, they did make it. They got half an hour. So this is just like a quick snippet of how much, like, I mean, besides the traveler part, like how the banter and humor is so encapsulated by the characters. And which brings me to my second question, or second part of this question. Because there's only 4 characters. We only have 4 characters through which we see there's minor characters here and there, which of course play a bigger part in the sequel. But throughout most of the story, it's these 4. So amongst those 4, was there one particular character that was your favorite, or did you just like different?
I actually really liked Brennan. Brenner. I really liked Brenner. Just because he was such a smarmy dude. He was such an ass. And I hate those people in real life, but I love to read about them because they're so funny. And it's like, I hate you, but you're hilarious. And I can't hate you as much as I should, because he did bad things. He was not a good person. But he was really funny. I also really liked Caliban. I have kind of this thing where I really like the paladin archetype. I really like a person. I really love characters who are dedicated to something greater than themselves, because but he's also someone who's very much questioning his faith, because he's not like a holy paladin. He's more of a workaday paladin, if that makes sense. But he's someone who has done something very brave and very noble and is paying for it. And it is not pretty or holy, and to just watch him have to deal with this very terrible situation he's in, and to deal with it like a real person. And he has breakdowns about it. Like, I felt he was a very, Brenner was my favorite character to read, but I felt Paladin was actually the most well done character, just in the care that was given to how complex his situation was, to how this paragon of a man who was kind of a brute, how he was humbled and weakened, but still remained this very admirable character without being overly good. And he was such a subtle and complex character, and I just loved watching that. That is where Ursula Vernon, by the way, that is in all of her books, that is where she shines. She writes characters that are never quite what you think, characters that are always more than what they seem. Even in books for 11-year-olds, you have these extremely layered characters. Like, again, shout out to Danny Dragonbreath. Actually, I love Clockwork Boys, but I think these books are actually better done, and they're really funny. We read like 13 of them. I absolutely love the story. And, but even the Danny Dragonbreath character, who is a young hotshot dragon, which I read all my dragons before I read this. I didn't steal anything, but I do love dragons. So might have some do it, but he's a layered character. He's not just some, kid story, hotshot boy protagonist. He has a lot of different things going on in a very kind of complex 11-year-old life, and the fact that she can do that in a book that can't be more than 30,000 words long is super impressive, because these are not big books, and the text, it's mostly pictures, and the text is big. The fact that she can do so much with so little is just blows my mind. I could never write for kids. I can't get under 100,000. I can't do it.
I'm glad for that, but no, I completely hear you on that. Like, writing for kids, it's a special art, because you have to write it for, and the books which are best are the ones which are written for kids, but also adults read and enjoy them. That's why probably Harry Potter was so exciting. And I'm going to check this out, because I didn't know about this. My son has recently got into reading a lot. So I want to get him away from Pokemon, and I'm hopefully more into these.
But good luck with that. Pokemon is a Hydra.
I know. He's talking about stuff which I have never read or heard or had an idea about. But my hope is that eventually I can get him onto the books that I love, and then watch him read and enjoy those books, and maybe talk to him about it. So that's my hope.
Would absolutely give Danny Dragonbreath series a try. It is beautifully written, and it is hilarious. And the fights are really good. It's got good combat.
I will check it out. It's written down.
The puns are A+, A+ puns. So.
Okay, so sorry. I keep on getting distracted and making you distracted. I want to get back to Caliban's point, the point which you made, because Caliban as a character is really tortured. Like, he has done, not him technically. So the demon, when he was possessed, made him kill several people. Now the demon has died. So he has this demon corpse, like you said, literally in his mind. His own god has shunned him because he cannot hear his god voice. And the worst part is all of his people from the other temples and his, I don't want to say sect, but like the group of people from where he came up with, even though he's a good person, now they shun him too. Like, that you're right in that he's tortured, not just because of the demon in his head from the past, which he can't escape with, but from the fact that everybody looks at him in horror. Like, was it truly the demon? Was it just him? Did he crack?
Yeah.
Is he still going to crack?
And here's the thing. This is a man who kind of technically did everything right. This is a man who's a hero. He saved people from this demon by taking it inside himself. But now for this act of heroism, he has been shunned. He's been shut out from everyone he knew. He's kind of adrift without an anchor. His whole world is over, and he's stuck with this horrible presence in his mind, this alien in his mind that he can never get rid of. And this inimical force. And it's like he's cursed for the rest of his life because he did a heroic thing. And he is very, very tragic. But at the same time, it's played very realistically. It's not just him, oh, I am Byronically suffering. You know, it's the real fallout of what would happen if he did this. And he has steps backward, and it's not the smooth path. I thought it was really realistic, done a case of PTSD, honestly. And I felt it was very lovingly and caringly done. You could really tell that she wanted to get it right. And I had great respect for her for that, because it would have been very easy to kind of give him a way out, to give him a solution. But, you know, no spoiler, she doesn't. He's stuck. And the story of him being stuck, and what do you do when you're just stuck in this terrible situation? You have to make the most of it. And how do you change who you are to be this new person in this new life when it's nothing like you thought you were going to? Like, that is a story that I would expect to hear in something literary, not in a self-published book about thieves and Clockwork Boys. But it is, and it's beautiful, and it sneaks up on you too. And I really enjoy it. I thought it was super well done.
It was, definitely. And kudos on the smarminess of Brenner. And you're very right about that. Like, it's good to read about assholes in in fiction rather than meet them in real life. Because in real life, you can't really read their thoughts. They're not going to be nice to you. But it's fun to read about them. And I would say he's less of an asshole, more of like a pragmatic person. He decides, and he knows what he's, what his talents are, and he just goes with those talents to get the best out of life for him. And of course, he has this past relationship with Slade. Yeah,
he's very cynical. But I also really respected her. I really respected the author for keeping him in character. Because a lot of times you'll get these asshole characters who are bad boys, but then they're good when it counts. Like when the chips are down, not Brenner. He is who he is to the end. And that took some guts, because I really liked him. I didn't want him to do what he did, but it made sense. It was totally in character, and I have no problems. And I'm not going to spoil it. It's great. I was very mad. There might have been some Kindle bashing, which I shouldn't do that to my Kindle. But it was, but it worked. It worked. And it's good to, again, you read so many books, and when you get that book that makes you just like, even when it makes you rage for the characters in a good way, that's the book you remember. That's the book you talk about in the podcast.
Yep. And that's the sign of a good writer. She wrote a good story.
Makes your heart do anything. Evoke an emotion is one of the hardest parts of writing. To evoke real, because you're basically, all of these people are fake, none of it's real. But if you can, the feelings that you make your readers feel, those are true. And so to take fake things and make real feelings is the art of writing, and the art of storytelling in general, because movies do it too. But I think writers, and I'm a little biased, but I think writers are the purest form of it, because we don't have music, we don't have pictures, we don't have all these like cheap ways into your heart. We only have words. It's all we have. And so to make people feel things just with the words is really a beautiful thing.
It is. And it's also because you can, those words, if they're strong enough, they will evoke the same emotion in different people, in different time periods, places. Movies, you're right, they're cheap. Because, when they're setting up a scene, the lighting becomes dark or light, the music starts cueing in, like when there's a sad scene, the music will kind of, and it's kind of like subtly done sometimes. Of course, not Bollywood movies aside. Bollywood movies are never subtle. No, they just launch into like loud crying or loud laughter to just prepare you for it. But at least I'll give that to Hollywood movies. They are at least subtle in that. Like they'll tweak your emotions without you knowing about it. But books, like you said, harder. Like when you're a wordsmith, you have to convey what the characters, the situation is, and make the reader cry if it is really needed.
Or to be angry. But when it happens in a book, because books are so much more intimate, because you're literally in the reader's head. When I make someone cry, it sticks, because I'm right there with the person. It's a personal one-to-one experience. Like I've only met a tiny fraction of my readers, but I have personally talked to hundreds of thousands of people. Nearly, I think I'm almost at 1 million books sold now. I have personally talked to hundreds of thousands of people one-on-one in the middle of the night who I will never meet. And that is a magic. That is the magic of writing. is that I can have these incredibly intimate interactions with people that they'll remember even a decade later. And I've never met them and they've never met me. But because of the book, we had this connection. And that's part of what makes writing so magical for me and so fun. And I love it.
And I love that I love that you write those books, because I would love reading those books. Now, with that being said, I'm going to end it over here with regards to Clockwork Boys. But I do want to ask you, because you did mention, like, you were on a kind of on a writing break due to the pandemic and everything for the past 18 months or more. Can you tell us a little bit, or at least can you reveal? I know there's no publication date set, but at least can you tell us if there will be a book release from you this year?
There will be a book release from me this year. There might even be two if we can get everything to line up. Because the first book was actually finished last year, but it takes a while to get everything together, even with self-publishing, because I go through a lot of editors, I go through a lot of copy editors. I want to make sure that my self-published books are the same quality as my New York published books. So I really try to take the time to get them done. But yeah, I have written a historical fantasy set in the Great Sioux War, but with magic. And it is a story, and I really wanted to write an epic fantasy of the West, because I love the West. And especially now that I live out in Colorado, the West is on my mind a lot, because it is a magical landscape and it has so much history. But I really, really wanted to write a Western that wasn't a John Wayne Western. This is about the real West, which was very diverse, which actually had a lot of very strong women in it, because when you're out in the frontier, a lot of times you don't have time for sexism. Someone's got to do it. She's going to do it. And I've always found that extremely inspiring and extremely interesting. Definitely not a time I want to live in. It was a very not nice time. But I find it very interesting. And I also find the war with especially the Great Sioux War, which is the war against the Lakota primarily, and the Cheyenne. There are a bunch of other tribes, but it was primarily the Lakota tribes. Extremely fascinating, because I did a ton of research for the Lakota on this book, because I really didn't want to get it wrong. And they are very different than both how they are depicted as the savages and how they are depicted now after kind of the pan-tribal era, after the reservation era. The Lakota I am writing about, these are the Lakota who were not on the reservations yet. They were still had their lands, and they were actively fighting the cavalry, and a lot of times winning. And it's a very different, I think we're going to find a very different Lakota than a lot of the popular media has in their head. We're also going to find a very different cavalry, because I have a lot of the cavalry are very big in my books. And I have a unit of the Buffalo Soldiers, the 10th Cavalry, who were the colored cavalry. There's a lot of racism in this book, because we are only 10 years after the Civil War. The slaves have only been free for 10 years. It's just such an interesting, terrible, beautiful time in American history. And as someone who's been thinking a lot about what it means to be an American because of everything that has happened, I feel it's a very important to go into this part of history, but not in a teachy way. Like, I'm talking a lot about this, but please don't think this is going to be a history lesson. This is a fantasy. We are going into magical caves full of magical crystal and having magical adventures. And it's called The Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow. The main character is half Lakota. There's actually it's a big ensemble cast. It's actually much more like my Eli Mompress series than I think any of the other books. Again, because it is a fantasy. Like, if this was set in Montana instead of Montana, it would be a fantasy. But because it's set in the West, I'm calling it a historical, because I am basing it on real events. But I think it's going to be wild. I think it's going to be like the stuff you've never seen. It's still a Rachel Aaron book. It's still good people in bad situations, trying to make the most of it, trying to do what's right. But it's a huge stage. I've actually never written a book that is this wide in scope. It was really difficult. And that's part of the reason it took me kind of so long to get around to it, because I put off writing this. I tried to write other books. I tried to write other DFZ books. During this long dead period, during the pandemic, I'm like, I don't want to write a giant historical fantasy. I mean, that was just, one, a ton of work. Two, not what I'm known for. Why do this to yourself, Rachel? But I loved this idea so much. And nothing else would work. I tried to do books I thought would be easier. Spoiler, there are no easy books. They don't exist. All books are hard. So write what you love, because it's gonna suck. It's gonna be a ton of work no matter what you do. So you have to do something you really, really like. And in order to get through it, in order to get through the bad parts, you got to have that momentum. And that is what I found in my Mary Goodcrow series. And I've got the first book in the can. It's at the final stage of editing. We're still waiting to hear if we're going to get audio out or not. That's going to be kind of the big deciding factor about when it comes out. Because if we decide to do audio later, then we can go ahead and release it. But if we're going to get audio in a reasonable time period, then we'll wait for the audio and do a simultaneous release, which is what I prefer. Because if I don't, I get a billion emails asking where the audio is. And it's coming, but it's just a lot of work. I love to do simultaneous releases, but it just depends. It's a new series. You got to find a narrator. We're still deciding whether or not I want to work with Audible again. I love Audible, but I also like not giving Audible all my money. So
Well, Audible are sneaky. There's a lot new Audible gate going on as well. Like they haven't been paying authors properly. I just read about that as well. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you. This is the part where I get to gloat to the viewers that I got to read at the ARC of The Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow, and it is absolutely amazing. Rachel, as you mentioned, it is historical fantasy. She's absolutely right. It is historical fantasy. And of course, there's epic moments in it. And I loved Mary Goodcrow. She is another quintessential Rachel Aaron character. And there's many more. There's not just her, there's many more. She mentioned there's an ensemble cast, so I can't wait for everybody else to read it. But I got to get a gloat a little that I get to read it. I got to read it first.
I had to give it to you first. Well, I figured if anyone is going to give me is going to tell me if this is a Rachel Aaron book, it's going to be Mihir, because you have been one of my #1 supporters since I started. You reviewed The Spirit Thief back when it first came out, way back in the day, when I was just a little baby author. And you have reviewed all my books, and I'm so grateful for all the support over the years. So thank you so much. And also all the awesome emails. Not to embarrass him, but he'll just send me emails on my birthday. And it's the best thing ever, because I'll be busy or distracted. I'll get an email from here, and I'll be like, happy birthday. I'm like, it is my birthday. Thank you. And I love it. It makes me feel it's just a bright ray of sunshine in my day. And I super appreciate it, because writing is so solitary. It's often just me in my writing office, and I'll go whole days where I don't go outside, which is my own fault and very unhealthy. But I don't have an office or coworkers or anything. I tend to hobbit. I'm kind of a extroverted introvert, if that makes sense. I'm good with people. I can do public speaking, but left to my own devices, I just kind of pull in and just am in my own little world. So it's really great to have someone like you who will just reach out to me and be like, hey, you never bother. It's awesome. And it's really important in this solitary life of writing.
Well, you're too kind. I always am worried that I am not coming across as that, kind of fan who's obsessed, who's going forward, hey, it's me again.
As someone who is also that fan, you never have to worry. I will never think that.
Well, you're too kind, but I did remember reading your books because I loved them. Because when I started reviewing as well, and Orbit had come out, and they seemed really interesting, and they're a lot of fun. And then of course, each series of yours has been building up. So every time I discover a new series of yours, it's oh yeah, this is something new, and it is amazing. So for me, it is always exciting. So I would love for you, when the book, the publishing dates get set, because this is one book series of yours which I'm very excited for the audiobook. And just because of the whole, this is spoilers, so I'm not going to say it, but it's I have read the book in the e format. Now I want to hear the book as well, because there's a audible element to the book which I want to see how it is explored. So I'm very interested in which narrator you can pick up and all of that.
I have never done so many accents ever. This book is the record for accents. I spent an entire editing pass just making sure everyone sounded like themselves. It's a very audible book. There are a lot of Westernisms, which is actually one of my favorite things. I really love all the Westernisms in the book. I love Westernisms in general. They're great. So yeah, I'm glad you have felt the same way. That's one of the reasons we're being so careful in the audio edition, because we really want to get someone good, but I also need someone who can do just a huge range. So it's asking a lot of a narrator. It really is. And we want to make sure we get the right person.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. Whenever that happens, I will be first in line to buy that audio edition as well. So Rachel, thank you so very much for your time today and for chatting with me. I know you're super busy. I know you have a book to write because you're on the second book right now, but still, I do want to thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been amazing and wonderful. I'm always happy to do these kind of things because, again, it gets me out of my shell and gets me out of my head, because I do get in my head a lot. It's kind of a hazard of the business. But it's also really fun to just talk about books with someone, because I mean, and I find this about all authors, we're readers first. We all got into writing because we really liked books. And it's always fun to talk about books with someone who also likes books. Because a lot of my talking about books is with my son, who's 12 and still sees reading as a punishment. And I'm like, no, books are amazing. And he's like, I don't like books. And I'm like, that's like saying you don't like stories. That's like saying you don't like television, you know, just because you didn't like that book. And anyway, I have lots of arguments with him about that. And he's like, you just say that you're an author. And I'm like, yes!
You should tell him yes.
I take personal offense.
Well,
I'm working on him. He can't escape me.
He's only 12. He's gonna be with you for for quite a while. Yeah. He'll come around. He'll come around. Well, thank you again once more. I just for all the viewers, I'll be putting all of Rachel's information, her website, her Goodreads, her Amazon, as well as all of her reviews down below, so you'll have all that information. And as soon as she's able to announce the book and all of its release details, I will be tweeting about it as well. So thank you again.
We are definitely going to be doing a giveaway when the book comes out. So we're going to be giving away some copies, and it's going to be awesome.
It is, and the book, believe me, is very, very, very much awesome. So for all of those who are very much excited, keep your eyes peeled. We'll be talking about it more in a few months, hopefully, or maybe even earlier. So thank you again, Rachel. Have a wonderful day.